Good morning, Year 9. Welcome to Lesson 5, looking at this big question: how had the Allied powers defeated the Axis powers by 1945? And remember, we're looking at the most significant events. What were the big reasons why the Allies won the Second World War? Today's question, and this is what you need to write as your heading, is: how far was Hitler's invasion of the USSR a key turning point? And you can write down the meanings of these key words, please. So siege, the front, and the name of a country called the Ukraine that you may have heard of. Okay, to just recap what we've done so far, here is a timeline starting in September 1939 and going through to May 1941, and all of the things that we've looked at in the lesson so far are on this timeline. So what I'd like you to do in your book or in your Word document, draw this timeline. Put the dates on it, so September, January and May, the two January dates to show when the year is changing. And then, as I have done, draw or write in these events. But the extra task that you need to do is put the specific date. So for example, the German invasion of Poland, the first event, happened on the 1st of September 1939. So we'd need to draw a line up from that box to the beginning of September and write in the date, 1st of September 1939. You should be able to find the dates for all the other events in your work from the last lesson. So that's just to recap what we've done already. We've thought about Britain declaring war, about evacuation, the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. Okay, a quick recap quiz. Pause the video and answer these questions if you can in your book. If you can't remember the answers, do look back and see if you can find them in your book from previous lessons. The pictures at the side might help to prompt your memory. Pause the video and answer the questions. Okay, first bit of the lesson then is asking, why did Hitler invade the USSR? And we're going to look at 5 different reasons. You don't need to write anything down, just listen. So the first reason is that in June 1941 the war was still going really well for Hitler. You can see on the map in the bottom left hand corner here, all the grey areas had been taken over by the Nazis. You see Switzerland is the little white country in the middle that has not been taken over. You see Britain is still green because it had resisted. Remember, the Battle of Britain had failed. The Nazis didn't launch their invasion. So but they did think that a new invasion was about to come, so the Nazis are really on the march. So one reason why Hitler invaded the USSR is because the war is going really well for him. Another reason why Hitler wanted to invade the USSR was because even though he'd signed a pact with Stalin to say that they wouldn't fight each other, he thought that this was that the Russian army was really weak and this was a great chance for him to take over part of the Soviet Union. The picture is showing the Russian tanks. So he thought the Soviet army was weak, and so even though he'd signed this deal with Stalin, he thought that actually they could beat them. Another reason why Hitler invades the USSR is because he wanted more living space, and you can see this map at the top shows how Hitler really wanted to expand for Germany into all of these areas, and he thought that they were going to take the land and he was going to use the Soviet people to be like slave labour in his land. So living space, or sometimes in the German word for it is Lebensraum. Another reason why is because these areas in the east had really good wheat fields, you can see that in the picture there, and also oil fields. And so Hitler thought these resources would be great to feed Germany and to strengthen the supplies to the army as well. And the last reason is that Hitler, remember, thought that communism was a really bad idea, and he thought that people in the Soviet Union would be really, really happy to see the Germans because they wouldn't want to be communist anymore. So here they are. He thought that the Soviets would welcome them. Now, it was a bit dodgy for Hitler to invade the USSR as well, because he's still fighting a bit on the west, fighting a bit in France, and he still has to invade Britain, but he decided that it was worth the risk and to invade the USSR. Okay, so in your book, can you write down, why did Hitler think that he could defeat the USSR even though they had a really huge army. So remember that second point that we just looked at. Remember, you can scroll back in the video to have a look, and then choose 2 reasons from the ones we've just talked about why Hitler invaded the USSR in that summer of 1941, and explain them in your own words. So you might want to go back to the previous slide and find 2 reasons. Can you explain them in your own words? Okay, when Hitler did invade, this is what happened. So here is a picture of the Soviet invasion. 3 million soldiers, over 3,500 tanks, over 7,000 guns, nearly 2,000 aircraft, and 750,000 horses were sent to the USSR. So they're really committed. They want to use that blitzkrieg, the lightning war strategy that has worked so well everywhere else. So the first thing Hitler does is send in huge numbers of troops. The USSR were caught by surprise, and by October the whole of the Ukraine, remember the word that you wrote down in the introduction, was conquered. The city of Leningrad, right in the north on this map at the top, was surrounded, and the German army had reached the outskirts of Moscow, the capital city. So at the beginning, Operation Barbarossa went very well, but as the Soviet army retreated, went backwards, and the German army came in, they used a strategy called scorched earth policy. And what they did was destroyed anything that the Germans would use to help their advance. Railways, buildings, crops and things. They also took their factories apart, and they carried them with them and rebuilt them behind some mountains, the Ural Mountains, and that was a barrier to the Germans, and they knew they'd be safer there. So when the Germans were there was nothing there for them to use. There was no food or fuel or anything left when the Germans got to different places in the Soviet Union. The next thing that happened was that by November 1941, the Russian winter arrived. Temperatures were 40 degrees below zero. Snowed and snowed and snowed. German soldiers froze to death because they weren't used to the temperatures, and they didn't have equipment to deal with them. And although the German tanks, the Panzer tanks, were better than the Russian tanks, the T-34s, the winter was too difficult for them. They weren't designed to operate in such cold temperatures, and they couldn't get the supplies of new parts or new equipment for the tanks because they were such a long way from Germany. So the German tanks, the German army, got stuck. Even despite that, though, and we mentioned Leningrad earlier, you can see that in the picture in the middle at the top, the people of Leningrad were besieged. The Germans laid siege to that city for over 2 years, and 1 million people in the city starved to death. But the Russian army were very determined. They continued to hold out against the German advance, and the Germans never made it much for any further than this. Okay, so just checking, can you complete these sentences based on what you've just learnt on the last slide? If you can't, again, go back in the video to listen again. Okay, source inference is something that we do in history, isn't it? And we know that we make inferences, which means to read between the lines. So here is a picture similar to the one on the last slide showing a German tank. And the question says, what can you infer from the source about why the German operations changed in December 1941? They stopped it being a war of movement, that blitzkrieg lightning war, to one where it was just about wearing each other down, who could hold out the longest. So complete the sentences here. I can infer, and what the details were in the picture that told you that. Here is another source. This one is a British source, and it's a cartoon, and it's called Joyride to Moscow. Hitler's sitting in the front, or near the front. The man with the black uniform on is the driver, and Hitler's sitting just behind him. And Hitler is saying, these treacherous Reds, meaning the communists, have deceived us again. And you can see the planes there in the sky are being shot down, it says. And so Hitler's saying they can fight, and he's clearly surprised that the Soviets are giving such a strong response. And on the back of the boat, it says joyride to Moscow, there and back before lunch. So it's about a joyride, a pleasure journey. They were expecting to get quickly to Moscow, but in fact we can see that they're surprised they've been held up. So you're going to answer this question about how useful this is, about what the Germans thought about the Soviet Union and the USSR. So remember we practiced this last lesson, so this time there's a bit of less guidance here for you. Think about the content of the source and use your own knowledge. What type of source is it? Remember it's a cartoon. The nature of the source, the origin of the source. So have a look. The 9th of July was just after Barbarossa started. And why was this cartoon made? And then how does all of that make it useful? So can you try to write at least 2 paragraphs, one about the content and the next one about the nature and the purpose of the cartoon. Once you've done that, you can move on to the next slide, which shows you a model answer. So use this model answer maybe to redraft in green pen or green font any of the work that you've already done, or use this to help you write a better answer. And if you've got highlighters, you could use them to highlight the different places where you've looked at. C for content, O for origin, and P for purpose. Okay, so why was the Operation Barbarossa important then? One reason it was important for the course of the whole war was because here in this picture you can see Stalin standing on the right hand side and Winston Churchill, who's leading Britain, and Roosevelt, who's leading America. And during this time, these 3 countries were allies. They were all united fighting the Germans. But between the time when the Nazis invaded, Stalin continually asked Britain and the Americans to try and re-invade into Europe, come back and try and fight the Nazis again in France, in Western Europe, because that would have meant that the Germans had to send soldiers back to the West and couldn't put all their pressure on the Russians, on the Soviets in the East. But the Roosevelt and Churchill, the other powers, decided that they wouldn't do that. They were quite happy to let the Nazis wear themselves out fighting the Russians, and then that meant that the British and the Americans could build up their forces and develop a strategy to invade France and attack the Germans much later when their armies were much stronger again. So Stalin kept asking for help, but it didn't happen, and that's one of the reasons why at the end of the war the relationship between these big 3 is a bit strained. But also the Soviet Union was very, very badly affected by the Second World War. So here is a quote from President Eisenhower, who went into the Soviet Union and Russia in 1945, and you can see what he said about what it was like there. And we know that 20 million people, Russian people, died, more than any other nation. And in the end, the Soviets stopped the German advance. So why is Barbarossa so important? Well, most historians think that without the sacrifice and determination of the Soviet army, the Second World War, would have lasted much longer and been much more difficult than it was. And so it was a really significant victory. And even Winston Churchill said that the Russians tore the heart out of the German army. So, put this as a subheading then, the significance of Operation Barbarossa. Can you explain why Britain and America didn't help the Soviets by invading France for all these years? Remember, this started in 1941, they don't invade till 1944. And can you then explain why this operation was a significant turning point in the course of World War II? Why was it so important? What contribution did the Soviets make to winning the war? And quick consolidate then. Can you, thinking back over what we've done this lesson, give one reason why Hitler began Operation Barbarossa? Then, can you write an example of what it was like, what happened in the operation? And can you explain one way it was significant? Well done. And finally, there's a quick recap quiz over what we have done this lesson. Well done for making it through to the end of the lesson.